Hey, welcome to Beyond Barley, a podcast from the Idaho Barley Commission where we go deeper into the industry members, programs, and partnerships shaping the barley industry. Today I am joined by Amaya Aguirre-Landa, Executive Director of the Idaho Grain Producers Association. The association's work focuses on serving the grain producers of Idaho by representing their interests at the county, state, and federal level to enhance their profitability and long-term viability. Today we're diving into the intersection of agriculture, legislation, and elections, and discussing how decisions made at the Capitol and at the ballot box can impact Idaho grain and barley producers. We will recap the 2026 legislative session, discuss the recent primary election, look ahead to November, and explore the issues likely to shape the 2027 legislative session. Whether you're deeply involved in current legislation or just curious about how policy connects back to agriculture here at home, this conversation is designed to make legislation approachable, practical, and relevant to the barley industry. So, Amaya, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Sydney.
There was a lot that came out of this legislative session and the recent primary election, so I'm really excited to have you here to help us give feedback and just unpack everything and connect it back to Idaho grain producers. So to start this episode off, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role with Idaho grain producers?
Absolutely. So Amaya Aguirre-Landa, I've been the Executive Director of the Idaho Grain Producers Association since October of 2024. And our role is to advocate on behalf of growers in the state and federal level. And then also that bridges into counties as well. So we handle political affairs and advocacy for the wheat and barley industries in the state of Idaho.
So for those who may not understand the relationship between IGPA and the Idaho Barley Commission and the Idaho Wheat Commission, could you take a moment to break down what our partnership and our relationship is between the two?
Absolutely. So the Commission's roles are to focus on market development, grower education, and research, and they're quasi-government agencies, and because of that, they cannot lobby on their own behalf. So that is where IGPA comes in. As a member organization, we provide that lobbying service within the state legislature and also within the federal government. So anything from transportation to water to workforce, anything that could potentially impact the wheat and barley industry, we have policy around those issues and advocate for them.
Well, so to follow up, what role does IGPA play specifically during the legislative session and during elections? Like, what does your work look like during those times?
Yeah. So the Idaho legislative session starts in January, and there is no set duration. Could be 60 days, could be 90 days. There were so many of our legislators worked in agriculture that it was kind of, based around the agricultural season. So once we got into the spring and folks needed to be in the field, things at the Capitol were being wrapped up. But for IGPA, that's our Super Bowl. That's go time. We're either monitoring legislation that can impact growers, or in some cases we might be facilitating specific legislation on behalf of growers. But those months of January, February, and March, and this year we came into the first week of April, myself and our lobbyist team are boots on the ground at the Capitol.
So I guess before we dive deep into specific legislation, we can start with the basics. So for growers who may not follow the legislative process closely, can you talk about why legislative decisions at the state level can really impact or have a serious impact on Idaho farmers and grain producers?
Absolutely. It's just as important at the state level as it is at the federal level. And in fact, potentially even more important, because decisions are being made specific to the state or even your region that you giving direct feedback or having a seat at the table is going to potentially be more impactful versus blanket legislation that is for an entire industry, no matter what state you're in. So, when we're talking about things like workforce, immigration, right to farm, you want those things to be very specific to what is going on within your state and your region. You don't want those decisions coming from, DC, where what it looks like for you in Idaho could look very different for someone in Washington State or Illinois or wherever else.
Absolutely. So why is it important for commodity groups and grower organizations to have a presence at the Capitol here in Idaho?
More and more, we are seeing less legislators being part of production, agriculture, and food production in general. It used to be, I can't remember the exact stats, but an overwhelming amount of our legislators were in production agriculture. So they understood the issues that producers faced every day. And now I believe it's less than 18% of our legislators. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's the figure I heard last, of our legislators are directly connected to production agriculture and food. So if we are not in the building advocating for the needs of growers, then they are going to be, either folks just don't know about them because they're not connected to that industry, or they're going to be drowned out by people from competing industries, competing interests, things like that. So keeping the needs of the industries relevant is hugely important in what we do. It's the being there, the being seen, and the talking to folks that is really impactful.
Well, you guys are also educators too at that point. Like you said, if there's less than 18% of legislators that are involved in Production Idaho, somebody has to be there to be a voice, and it's more important now than ever.
Oh, absolutely. I think I don't know that this is necessarily a recent shift, since I'm obviously relatively new, so to speak, in this role. But it used to be you were really doing that education during the legislative session, and now it has become more of a year-round effort. So facilitating on-farm legislative education, connecting with legislators during the summer and fall leading into the session, and continuing those conversations to continue to be relevant.
Yeah. So building on to that, what is the current biggest misconceptions lawmakers or the general public have about agriculture here in Idaho?
We are still an ag state. I think that's probably gets drowned out a lot, especially in the Treasure Valley, because our urban sprawl has grown so much. And you're seeing less and less of even just driving between Boise and Caldwell. There's less and less fields along I-84. So people are getting farther and farther removed from the farm, our legislators and just general consumers. But ag is still it's a workhorse in our economy. It's not just your farmer down the road. It is food production, it's transportation. It is an industry that greatly impacts our state, and we still are an ag state. And I think it's important for folks to understand that it's not only bringing that into our economy from a financial standpoint, but it's the food on your plate as well. So helping keep that industry healthy is, security for our state, it's national security, and it helps keep food accessible and affordable for Idaho families.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, honestly. And I think we have that increasing population coming in and moving to Idaho. Like we all say, Idaho's been discovered, right? And those, a good chunk of those individuals come from urban areas, and they come to Idaho where, agriculture is still very much part of our culture, and it's not far from our urban areas. And so being able to advocate for agriculture and let people know that Idaho is still an agriculture state is really, really important, not only for lawmakers, but also like the general public, like you were talking about. So thank you for leaving that for us. So to flip that, what is the biggest misconception growers have about the legislative process?
I think for your average grower, the legislative process is very intimidating. You don't have to go that far out of Boise to get into our rural areas, but our state is very diverse and very spread out, and a lot of our growers are pretty far removed from Boise and just kind of the overall culture amongst the capital. So I think it can be very intimidating, and they question whether or not their voice matters.
Absolutely. So, for grain producers specifically, why should they pay attention to legislation even if they aren't actively involved in politics?
At the end of the day, I mean, I think you can be active, or I guess I should say not active, but engaged in politics without having to be actively involved. There's decisions being made that will impact you. And I think if you're choosing to engage, whether it through an association or through yourself personally, I think associations, like IGPA or, others, they help kind of create that funnel of, okay, let's break things down for you. This is what's going on, and this is why it's going to matter to you. And this is why you should potentially, take a stance on it, because just because you choose not to engage does not mean those choices will not impact you. So I say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And which is so fitting for food, but it's, it is that you can't then stand by and say, I didn't know about it, which, unfortunately isn't an out. So, just because you were unaware does not then mean whatever that choice is doesn't apply to you. It's just I think people oftentimes get overwhelmed by the whole process. And now with all the different forms of media, you kind of get inundated, and it's a little tough to cut through the clutter. So overall, I think there's never a downfall to being educated on the issues that could potentially impact you and your industry and your family.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't say it better myself, and I'm totally going to use the "you're not at the table, you're on the menu." All right, so let's talk a little bit about what happened during the most recent legislative session. IGPA tracked a really active session this year with over 1,000 pieces of legislation drafted. And was it 349 bills ultimately passed in both chambers?
Yeah, it feels like it too.
So, Amaya, from your perspective, what stood out the most about the tone or the overall direction of the session?
From an agricultural standpoint, there were some wins, and then there were some really tough climbs, I would say. There were a couple pieces of legislation that helped bolster rights for growers, like from the transportation standpoint. If anyone here lives in rural areas, you will know what is potentially the unsafeness of equipment on roads. So putting in place legislation that makes that so farmers can use their critical thinking skills of when is going to be the safest for them to move off the road and the oncoming traffic. There was some wins in some out-of-state legislation, so Utah's fuel tax that would potentially greatly impact our Idaho growers. Lots of, coming together by the industries that would potentially impact to help share with our friends in Utah why that was maybe a bad idea. And then also, we saw a lot of water legislation and a lot of workforce legislation. And thankfully, we work with two organizations that know those areas very well. IGPA is great at advocacy, but it's even better when you have partners, especially partners that are specialized in those areas, that can keep you up to speed on, what of these pieces of legislation is really going to impact your specific area. But it was a tough year for legislation. We saw a lot of budgetary cuts that impact, institutions and agencies directly related to agriculture. So the University of Idaho and also the Idaho State Department of Agriculture. And, overall, I think I would say that it was a challenging year.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking back at the 2026 session, what would you consider the biggest wins for Idaho agriculture?
I would say some of the biggest wins didn't necessarily didn't necessarily take place within the Capitol per se, but it really not necessarily forced, but maybe re-emphasize the importance of ag groups working together. As there's less and less of us, we are really stronger in numbers. So, getting on the same page about high level issues and talking points has been huge, and being able to work with my colleagues and all of us, thankfully work together well. We're always going to have our respective issues that we need to work on potentially independently, but being able to jointly represent ag as a whole in a growingly challenging climate is important. And it was great to see us all come together to work on issues, and even potentially sometimes issues that they might minorly impact the grain industry, but they may largely impact, XYZ industry. But for ag as a whole, we're working together toward a joint mission.
Absolutely. So were there any pieces of legislation that grain producers should be aware of that may not have received as much public attention?
Not that I can think of. They're really, from when IGPA is tracking legislation, so weekly members receive a legislative update, and it's a breakdown of all the bills, ag and sometimes non-specifically ag-related budget, things like that. And yeah, really anything that would have directly impacted the grain industry, folks would have known about. So nothing that I can think of.
All right. So were there any bills or proposals that concerned agricultural organizations heading into this session?
I'd say the bills that were most concerning, and we talked about, there was a lot of water legislation and there was a lot of workforce legislation. And why that is concerning is grain is one of those interesting things within the state of Idaho that it looks very different depending on where you're located as a grower. If you're in a dryland irrigation area versus the Treasure Valley, Magic Valley, eastern Idaho, where you're relying on irrigation, your workforce can also look very differently. So as an organization, we approach that accordingly. We know that our dog in the fight is not going to be as big maybe as dairy, but it is important because we do have growers in those irrigated areas that usually are growing things outside of grains, pulses, oil seeds, things like that require a greater workforce. Yeah. And specifically to E-Verify, something that was important for our grower membership to understand is that would impact them regardless of the size of their operation. Depending on the piece of legislation, there were different versions that would have depended on private versus state and how many employees you had, etc. But making sure that they understand that it would apply to you potentially, whether or not it was maybe you, your dad, one of your children, and maybe a seasonal employee would apply to you the same as somebody bringing in 25 to 50 seasonal employees. So understanding the impact of things like that, because there was, I think, some misinformation about, well, it's me and just a handful of folks that I hire locally, so this is maybe not an issue for me, and unfortunately it would be. And I would say the same goes for water. It looks very different for folks up in the Panhandle and Bonners Ferry than it does for somebody farming in, Meridian or Idaho Falls. So, addressing the issue accordingly based on what their different needs are within the region.
Yeah, absolutely. So this session really marked a shift into the budget deficit after several years of surpluses, right? So, which included proposed agency reductions and statewide holdback. So how did that fiscal environment shape conversations around agricultural priorities?
Like I mentioned, the two agencies and institutions that we can directly see a financial impact to is the University of Idaho. And I mean, nobody would know that better than the commissions, since they work so closely with them with research. And then the Idaho State Department of Agriculture for regulatory and enforcement reasons. Talking with ISDA, they have done a great job in figuring out how they are going to do more with less. And I would say that U of I has likely done the same. But that pressure, the inability to be able to, fully equip a workforce as we head into the season, when you have things like inspectors that need to be in the field and things like that, having to adjust, potentially what turnaround time looks like or whatever it may be. Those are things that, we're bound to see impact production in some way. Not necessarily negatively impact. I think probably more we're going to have to change the expectation of how we see things and what these agencies are able to provide and in what timeline they're able to provide them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a major shift, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So wildlife depredation continues to be a major issue for growers throughout the state. So 2 bills this session address depredation funding and wildlife relocation transparency. What problems were those proposals trying to solve?
So neither of those bills, I believe, made it out of their committees, but Representative Schertz was the sponsor for the depredation bill, and I've had lots of conversations with growers in the Bonners Ferry area because the elk population up there can just absolutely decimate their crops. And what it ultimately came down to was not that we didn't see that he didn't see a need for the bill. It's that more work needed to be done on the bill, where the funding was potentially going to come from, and just the additional details of what that would potentially look like. So we foresee that bill coming back in the 2027 session.
Okay.
The relocation bill, and I cannot remember who the sponsor was, also I believe did not make it out of committee, but that had to do with notifying folks, grower or not, within an area when large game was going to be introduced into an area. So having talked with some growers, an instance that was outlined for me was in the Idaho Falls into like the Hamer, when you start getting closer to like Island Park and the Yellowstone area, relocating things like bears and notifying folks when bears are going to be relocated. Yeah. And it sounds like there's already a good line of communication around that. Mm-hmm. So more to come, but that could potentially just be codifying of existing processes.
Well, even though they didn't pass or even really make it out of committee, it seems like there was a lot of positive progress made for those.
Yeah, absolutely. There was just an acknowledgement that the problem does exist, and how we could potentially improve how it's dealt with.
Mm-hmm. So workforce continues to be a major challenge across agriculture. And this session included ongoing debates around E-Verify and employer requirements. What should producers understand about where those conversations stand today?
Limbo. In the 2027 session, we will, without a doubt, see lots of legislation around workforce again. I don't think that we will probably see a session where we don't have a piece of workforce legislation. Yeah, without a doubt, in the 2027 session, it came down to kind of like the 11th hour of the session. Lots of changes were going on, and yeah, I would say the conversation is to be continued, and we will without a doubt see it in 2027.
That's a big conversation piece for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, within the state and nationally.
Yeah. So how would you describe the overall relationship between Idaho agriculture and lawmakers during this session? How did that feel?
I would say depends on who you're talking to. We are fortunate that even with the diminishing population of producers in the state house, there are still a lot of friends of agriculture, and they understand the impact of the industry and the needs of producers. And we're so fortunate to have them, and that they're willing to listen and talk to folks that are, experts in their industry to help them make decisions. So I would say it's a balance between those folks, and then maybe the folks that are, if they're willing to listen and have a conversation, that is probably what matters most.
Yeah.
And really, truly, we have very few people that fall into that category of, I'm not interested. I have my opinion and I cannot be swayed. So, but again, it's just that continuing to see folks and be seen and continue to stay relevant, because you have to keep at it, or it's that relevancy piece that is just huge within state and federal.
It's like they say, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Right?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
So what should Idaho agriculture organizations take away from the 2026 session?
I would say now more than potentially ever, because of the ag economy, because of some of the misinformation that ag is combating within the state and the nation, that continuing to stay active and communicate with your legislators is extremely important.
Absolutely. So if you guys haven't already, be sure to check out the 2026 Idaho Legislative Session Overview in the most recent IGPA magazine in the summer edition. But we know legislation is shaped by people elected to office, so let's talk a little bit about elections. The fun part, huh? So Idaho just concluded its primary election on May 18th. What were some major takeaways from Idaho's recent primary election?
I would say one positive and one negative. Overall, it was a win for ag. We saw a lot of ag-friendly folks either that were incumbents either win their elections, or folks that are new coming in or returning to the legislature win. But also looking at voter turnout, that's definitely an area that we could, as an association, stand to communicate with our membership better about. And as a state overall, the primary elections are so vitally important in Idaho because of the stronghold that the Republican Party majority has. And so it is potentially the most important election that we have, even over the general. It in many ways depicts who is going to be in office. So I think better communicating why that is, so folks understand, by no means does that mean because you voted in the primary, don't go vote in the general. But right. Understanding why the primary is important, and why you do what you need to do so that you're able to vote if you're out of town, being able to vote absentee and all the different things that are available to you as a voter in the state of Idaho. But voter turnout was just over 30%, like 30.1%, I believe. Yeah. So that's an area we could stand to improve.
What should Idaho grain and barley growers be paying attention to between now and the November election?
I'd say two things. Educating yourself about the folks that are the candidates that are running. So when you go to the ballot box in November, you know the issues that they're running on. If they are an incumbent, you've potentially taken the time to look at their voting record, which is public, so you can see, they might be saying one thing, but what are their votes saying? Yeah. And then also planning to vote, doing what you need to do to be able to, that you're able to cast your vote in November.
So what issues do you anticipate candidates discussing that could impact agriculture? Any hot button issues?
I think this goes back to what we saw in the session, and I've seen a lot of candidates. Workforce seems still just to be a huge thing, and government efficiencies. And our state is known for its government efficiencies. It's known for having, as little red tape as possible. But I still think, because those are a lot of core Idaho values, that we still see those as the topics that folks are running on.
Yeah, absolutely. So what advice would you give producers who want to become more informed voters, and maybe what resources would you recommend?
It is so hard for folks to know, where, when they're getting their information, is it factual? Is it unbiased? And I think there's a couple different areas you can start. If you can, getting to know those candidates personally, attending candidate forums, debates that are being held in your area. Lots of county organizations or regional organizations will host those, from everything from your county level candidates all the way up to your state level candidates. And then you can also have, personal conversations with them at those and ask questions yourself. Utilizing your associations or, special interest groups that you're part of. Oftentimes they will kind of dig through that information for you. They'll, put together folks' voting records so you can review them about pieces of legislation that are specific to you, your needs, your interests, your industry, whatever it may be. And also, I would say just, do some digging on their websites and look at the key issues that, if you're going to attend those forums, maybe do some homework, if you will. some research, some homework, to see, what are the things that they're campaigning on, and, be prepared to ask them, some tough questions, because if they're elected, they work for you. They work for their constituents, so they should be able to answer those questions, especially if it's something they're campaigning on.
Absolutely. So as we look towards the 2027 legislative session, what issues are, already beginning to emerge?
I feel like you can just put this on repeat for the entire podcast. Water and workforce.
Water, workforce. Remember that. Okay. Where do you see the biggest opportunity for Idaho Ag over the next several years?
It is a really tough time for a variety of reasons, whether it be the drought, the farm economy in its current state, the lack of a farm bill, the increasing threats on producers, and the either unfortunate or fortunate part of hard times is that it builds resilience. Something that we're seeing within just IGPA is that those hard times are making people more aware just how important some of the advocacy organizations are on their behalf. And the unfortunate reality is sometimes that's what gets you out, and that's what gets you talking to folks, and that's what gets you, doing the hard work. But ultimately, hard times build resilience, and I think we are going to end up being in a stronger place because of this. Unfortunately, that's how we have to get there, and it pulls. One positive I would say is it's good to see that pulling folks together, because what we don't want to see when times are hard is that's when folks are turning to their various corners. It's tough. It's tough to fight through personal issues when you turn inward. It's tough to fight through larger issues when you turn inward. So seeing growers come together to help support themselves, support their industries, and fight for the things that they need, I think will be the silver lining to this not so great time we're working through.
Absolutely. So are there any policy areas where Idaho Ag can be more proactive proactive rather than reactive?
I don't know. I wouldn't say there's a specific policy area. I think just the being involved before it's absolutely necessary that you be involved. And a lot of this, I kind of turn toward especially getting to know your legislators. Most of them, I would say an overwhelming majority of them, are very approachable folks, and they live in your area and they know your communities. And if you can build a relationship with them, I mean, it doesn't need to be so close that you're going over to their house for dinner on a Friday night or anything like that, but you know that they at least know who you are before you're calling them or emailing them about an issue. That can potentially cut through the clutter. You're building up trust. They trust you as someone within the industry and working on building that. And I understand that it's very intimidating for a variety of reasons. If this is somebody that you don't know at all, you're trying to make an introduction to somebody who's a complete stranger, or, maybe you potentially have differing views to this person. So finding a middle ground could be challenging as well. And, even if it's that you're, say they're at your local Farm Bureau meeting, going there so that you can at least get a face-to-face interaction, and them putting a name to an email is going to serve you better than when, it's something's on fire and you're calling them in a state of urgency.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the way that, growers can really help to educate these policymakers too, and just being able to build a relationship. And, maybe one day they'll call you and say, hey, what do you think about this? Or can you find me some resources where I can learn more about this? And building those relationships, I think, are really important.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm here to talk to them. Our lobbyists are here to talk to them, but ultimately that's who they really want to hear from. Mm-hmm. They, when you're calling them or emailing them, they want to hear from, so-and-so over in X county, and I want to talk to you about bill number 123 because it's going to impact me in the following ways. That is much more meaningful coming from a constituent than it is from a lobbyist.
Yeah, absolutely. So what can producers do today to stay informed and engaged throughout the year and not just during the legislative session?
Education. I mean, education and being engaged in your association. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be, on a committee or on the board or anything like that. It could just mean reading your email when those pieces of communication are coming out, breaking different issues down for you, actually reading through them. And if you have questions, asking the questions of your, whether it be an executive director like me or, somebody else within the association, or, your local board member calling and be like, hey, I've been reading this, I've been hearing this. What exactly does that mean? So, I mean, I don't think it needs to be, some huge thing or a voluntary position or anything like that. It can simply be just being an active listener.
Yeah, and asking all the questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Amaya, one final question, and we'll stop torturing you. So, if a grower only remembers one thing from this entire legislative session this past year, what do you want that to be?
One thing? Maybe one sentence? I would say get involved. We'll say participate. Participate is a good word, because that can mean a variety of different things. It can be participate in the process, participate in listening. But yeah, I think ultimately anytime you're, participating in the process as a voter, participating in the process as an association member, you are going to come out better and more informed on the other end.
Absolutely. Well, Amaya, thank you so much for joining me today and just helping us break down the importance of current policy and legislation in a way that connects directly back to Idaho barley growers. So,
absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We hope today's conversation helped make agriculture policy and legislation feel a little more approachable and highlighted just how connected decisions made at the Capitol are to the success of Idaho farms and rural communities. Whether it's staying informed, engaging with elected officials, or simply understanding the issues impacting agriculture, every grower has a role to play in helping shape the future of our industry. So, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and follow along for more conversations connecting growers, industry partners, and the people helping shape the future of the barley industry. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next time on Beyond Barley.